I analyzed over 500 Reddit comments to answer one of the hottest questions in AI coding today. Which is better, Claude Code or Codex? To answer this question, I built a sentiment analysis dashboard where I scraped Reddit and then ran an LLM to classify the sentiment of comments, mostly on our Claude Code and our chatgptcoding. I will explain why those subreddits were focused on later. But we have the amount of people who prefer Claude Code. We have the amount of people who prefer Codex. We can weight by upvotes or not by upvotes. And we can also filter by themes such as pricing, performance, reliability, and see which way the comments skew on each of those topics. Now, this dashboard is publicly deployed. I will link it at the top of the description. If you want to dig into it and play with it yourself, filter on some different themes, etc. I will also link the source code if you want to see how I made it. And finally, I will link my written version of this video on my newsletter, AI Engineering Report. Subscribe to that if you're interested in topics about AI and engineering. The rest of this video will be broken down into two topics. The first is, what can we learn from the sentiment dashboard about Claude Code versus Codex? Which features of Claude Code are better received by Redditors, and which categories is Codex better received on, and what's the overall breakdown? The second topic will be the methodology of building this dashboard. How did I find the subreddits and pick them? How did I do the sentiment classification with an LLM? Now let's first look at the high-level numbers. If we just look at the raw number of comments that compare and prefer one or the other, 65% prefer Codex to 34% prefer Claude Code. Now I also added a button that you can click to weight by upvotes. So instead of one comment being one vote, if the comment got 10 upvotes, it counts as 10. And that actually makes the comparison even more skewed. Now Codex has 79.9% preferring it and Claude Code only 20.1%. Now let's look at the absolute counts. I asked the LLM to identify if a given comment directly compared Codex and Claude Code or just mentioned one. Of the direct comparisons, 98 preferred Codex, only 18 preferred Claude Code. But if we look at the comments that just talked about one, we can see the sentiment on both is actually negative. Codex has 4 positive and 7 negative. Claude Code is worse with 14 positive and 26 negative. But one very important thing I'm going to talk about a lot is there's just a lot more volume of discussion of Claude Code. In fact, at the beginning, I mentioned that I analyzed 2 subreddits, but really I was analyzing 3. Chatgptcoding, which is fairly neutral despite its name, Claude Code, and Codex. But Claude Code has by far the highest volume of discussion, even more so if I included Claude AI, which is a bit too noisy. But one of the topics I'm seeing emerge is that there's a lot more conversation about Claude Code in general. And given Reddit tends to be pretty negative, it does make me wonder how much of this is just hating on the thing that's popular. Now let's look at this dashboard breakdown by category. We can see if Claude Code gets ahead on any individual category or if Codex has even more of a lead on certain categories. Let's go through one by one. On pricing, we see Codex has the lead. A lot of people are frustrated with Claude Code's usage limits. For performance, we have a slight lead from Codex. For reliability, again, a slight lead. Workflow is a category where we see Claude Code come out on top. This aligns with my anecdotal experience where people like a lot of the quality of life features in Claude Code. They even released some more in Claude Code 2.0. People feel like the Codex CLI experience is not quite up to par with Claude Code in terms of quality of life features. Now for speed, we see Claude Code slightly ahead. This doesn't surprise me based on my personal experience. Claude Code is much faster. That's why I personally am still using it more. But if we weight by upvotes, Codex is ahead. This really surprised me because it did feel like something where Claude Code was better on. But if I drill down and look at the comments, someone says Codex is 10x better. And by the way, you can click on view on Reddit if you want to read it yourself. It's not just a good experience since the text is hard to read and it's slow, but it fixes shit every single time. So this goes back to that quality of life stuff I talked about. But what I realized by reading this comment is he's talking about speed in terms of overall getting work done. He's not necessarily talking about a given response time. So speed is a little ambiguous, and obviously we have 3 comments versus 4 comments. I am trying to improve the size of this data set, scrape more comments, That's a work in progress, but we're certainly getting some hints as to which way the crowd leans based on what we see so far. So let's go back up, turn off wait by upvotes again, and I want to look at usage limits. 85% prefer Codex. No surprise here because the Claude Code usage limits were highly controversial. They got worse and people are hitting them very quickly. Code generation, we see Codex somewhat ahead. Problem solving, we see Codex 11 of 11 way ahead. It feels like for complicated problems, this is where people are strongly preferring Codex. Model performance, we see Codex ahead. Surprised me a little bit because Sonnet 4.5 is so good, but the comments prefer Codex. And code quality, way ahead, 7 of 8, way more for Codex. Let's look at weight by upvotes. 95% of upvoters think Codex generates better code. Of course, code quality is subjective, but I do think there's wisdom in the crowds, which is the whole reason I ran this sentiment analysis. Now, I do want to dig into some of these comments. And again, we can filter by the comparison type. I want to look at the top one that says Claude Code is better than Codex. We can click this view on Reddit. It opens it up. And this person basically doesn't have a super strong opinion. He says GPT-5 Codex is great, but sometimes he hits the limits faster than he does on Sonnet. He's on the $20 a month plan. He likes Claude Code much more and the surrounding ecosystem of tools, a common refrain. He says try them all, but he thinks Sonnet's hard to beat. And then for Codex, one thing we have a little bit of a dark horse, which is GLM, which is a Chinese model. It kind of threw off some of these discussions. I'm going to ignore this top one, and I'm going to look at this top comment. It says, the biggest challenge I've given it so far was to refactor a long overdue and messy CS file that contained 3K lines of code. I've tried it with all other LLMs, including Claude Code, but they just ultimately make bugs and mess things up when trying to do so. I didn't think GPT-5 would be any different, but my God, it surprised me again. I played with it, did it in small pieces at a time, and a day or so later, I'm down to around 1K lines of code. This is circling back to this theme that GPT-5 and Codex are better for these messy, complicated problems. Okay, I think we have some interesting conclusions on the sentiment. I want to talk about my process in building the dashboard. The first question is, why did I pick those 3 subreddits? Well, first, I actually did a Google search with sitereddit.com, Claude Code, and Codex to figure out what subreddits to even include. And the vast majority were Claude AI and Claude Code and chatgptcoding. There was a little bit of other ones such as OpenAI and Codex and LLM devs, but the conversation was dwarfed by the first 3 I mentioned. And it is interesting to me that, again, there's so much talk about Claude Code. It's hard to say if it's truly unpopular or if it's getting this much hate because it is popular. More people are using it, and that's more opportunity for people to express frustration, especially on a site like Reddit. Now, after I decided on those subreddits, I wondered if I should use the Google Search API or the Bing API, but neither were really appropriate. The Bing API is shutting down, and I didn't want to have to redo this project later. And Google actually does let you do some programmatic queries, but it's very limited. You can only get 100 results. So I decided to just use the Reddit API, and I was able to do all this analysis for free. It's pretty generous. I know there's some controversy over the Reddit API price change, but I think that's for third-party apps that extensively use the API. If you're just doing a one-off scrape and analysis like I'm doing, it worked great. Now, for the actual sentiment analysis, I did, of course, use LLMs. It was interesting. I was at OpenAI Dev Day last week, and they mentioned that sentiment analysis was one of the first applications of LLMs. It is a hard problem in computer science. One of the posts I came across doing this analysis said, Claude Code is terrible, but its competitors are even worse. And if you think about it, that's pretty much positive sentiment for Claude Code if they're saying it's better than all of its competitors. But there's a lot of nuance if they lead with Claude Code is terrible to figure out that's actually kind of a positive thing. So in terms of the models I did use Claude Haiku, which is one of the cheaper models. I wasn't trying to spend a bunch of money for no reason if Haiku did a good enough job. just taking a quick pass at my dashboard, it seems for the most part it did. Of course, I would be curious to rerun with fancier models and see if there's any difference, but I doubt there's a huge one. The bigger issue is probably speed. This only cost me less than $1 per run, so it was pretty affordable even doing hundreds of comments. The bigger issue was it was taking me about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, I forget exactly, to do 500 plus comments. So it was a little tedious, especially when I wanted to rerun, and especially if I want to add a lot more comments to the data set. But it is a fun LLM project for me, and I'm hoping to expand it, especially if there's interest in this topic. Thanks for watching. Again, I'm planning to expound on this project, but I would be very interested to hear any feedback. And of course, I appreciate likes, subscribes on YouTube. Check out my newsletter as well if you like reading stuff. Thanks for watching.